The materials contained in this file were recovered during a routine interdepartmental audit of municipal transit archives conducted after the consolidation of several regional authorities into a single infrastructure oversight body. Most of the records were misfiled, scanned under incorrect project identifiers, or stored in physical boxes marked for destruction but never removed. There was no singular discovery moment. Instead, the file assembled itself gradually through coincidence, duplication, and the quiet insistence of paperwork that did not align. The earliest document is a maintenance work order, referencing a tunnel segment officially sealed during a safety remediation effort nearly 20 years ago. The seal date, the reason, and the approval signatures are all present and appear legitimate. What drew attention was not the closure itself, but a handwritten notation in the margin, added later in a different ink, stating that the tunnel had already been sealed when the crew arrived. Initially, this was assumed to be an error. The transit authority responsible for the tunnel had undergone multiple restructurings, and record continuity was poor. That alone would not have warranted Vault 13 involvement. However, as additional documents were cross-referenced, the same phrase appeared again and again in inspection summaries, supply requisitions, and incident memos. Each instance treated the statement as unremarkable, as if it were common knowledge. The tunnel segment in question does exist. It lies beneath a decommissioned rail spur that once served an industrial district, no longer present on modern maps. The spur was abandoned following a partial collapse caused by ground subsidence, and access points were sealed to prevent unauthorized entry. According to official records, the tunnel has remained closed since. The recovered materials suggest otherwise. Over the course of several years, multiple crews were dispatched to the site for unrelated infrastructure projects, including fiber conduit installation, drainage assessment, and structural reinforcement of adjacent tunnels still in use. Each time the sealed segment was encountered. Each time, crews documented evidence of prior sealing efforts predating the one on record. Each time, those observations were noted briefly, then dismissed. No investigation was opened. No anomaly reports were filed. The matter was never escalated. What makes this file suitable for Vault 13 is not the existence of contradictory records, but the consistency with which those contradictions were acknowledged and then ignored. The documents do not express confusion or alarm. They read as procedural. The language remains dry. Even when handwritten notes begin to appear, they do not speculate, they instruct. Several items were recovered in damaged condition. Water exposure, mold growth, and particulate contamination are present across multiple decades of documentation, despite the materials being stored in separate facilities. Audio recordings extracted from field radios contain interference inconsistent with the equipment models listed. Video survey footage is incomplete, with missing segments that cannot be attributed to data corruption alone. Of particular note is a series of personal log entries attributed to a foreman assigned to the most recent reopening effort. These entries were never submitted to the authority. They were found folded inside a safety manual, pressed flat as if intentionally hidden. The foreman's name does not appear in any final project roster. I have reviewed this file alongside other Vault 13 holdings involving subterranean infrastructure, sealed access points, and repeated containment actions without recorded cause. While no direct overlap can be established, the structural similarities are difficult to ignore. In several cases, the decision to reseal appears to have been made locally, without external directive, and without subsequent documentation explaining why. This file does not contain a discovery of something unknown. It contains evidence of something known, encountered, and deliberately buried more than once. The following sections reproduce the recovered materials in chronological order where possible. Where chronology cannot be established, I have preserved the original grouping to reflect how the documents were found. Editorial notes are limited to clarification of dates, terminology, and redactions required under Vault 13 containment protocols. Listeners are advised that the absence of conclusions in this record is not accidental. It is procedural. The first documented encounter occurred during what was classified as a minor access review. A utilities subcontractor had been contracted to survey unused subsurface corridors beneath the former East Line industrial spur, with the intention of identifying viable routes for new fiber conduit. The spur itself had been decommissioned for nearly 3 decades. The surface structures were gone, replaced by parking lots and light commercial buildings. Below ground, however, the original rail tunnels remained on record, sealed but structurally intact. According to the work order, the task required only visual confirmation of tunnel integrity up to the sealed point. No entry beyond the barrier was authorized. The crew consisted of 3 individuals: a site supervisor, a safety officer, and a junior surveyor tasked with documentation. Their names appear on the sign-in sheet, along with the date and time of entry. The initial paperwork is unremarkable. The access point was located behind a locked service door in the basement of a municipal storage facility. The door had not been opened recently. Dust accumulation and corrosion patterns suggested years of disuse. The lock was cut under authorization, and the door was propped open for ventilation. The tunnel beyond sloped downward gently, wide enough for a single rail line with a narrow maintenance walkway along the right side. Lighting was minimal. Portable lamps were deployed at regular intervals as the crew advanced. Approximately 40 meters from the entrance, the tunnel terminated in a concrete wall. This matched expectations. The seal was clearly visible in archived diagrams. The crew documented the condition of the wall, noting surface cracking consistent with age, but no signs of compromise. The junior surveyor photographed the area, capturing the wall from multiple angles. It was during this documentation that the first anomaly was noted. Behind the concrete seal, partially visible through a hairline fracture near the floor, was a second surface. The texture was different, smoother, lighter in color. not rock and not part of the original tunnel construction. The safety officer recorded the observation verbally, stating that it appeared as though the tunnel had been sealed more than once. The supervisor responded that the appearance was likely due to layered reinforcement or a repair overlay applied during the original closure. No further action was taken. The final report from this survey includes a single line under additional notes. Seal appears reinforced, no access required. The matter would have ended there if not for a supply requisition filed 3 weeks later. The requisition requested cutting equipment rated for reinforced concrete, portable bracing supports, and additional respiratory gear. The justification cited unexpected structural layering encountered during preliminary inspection. Approval was granted automatically. The second entry into the tunnel occurred at night, scheduled to avoid disruption to adjacent facilities. This time, the crew was expanded to 6 individuals, including a structural engineer and a municipal inspector assigned to observe. The concrete seal was breached methodically. The outer layer was thicker than anticipated, measuring nearly twice the depth specified in original plans. Removal took several hours. As sections were cut away, the presence of a second barrier became undeniable. Behind the first seal was another wall. This one was older. The material composition differed from the outer layer. Aggregate size suggested an earlier construction period. The surface bore tool marks inconsistent with modern equipment. At several points, faded warning paint was visible, though the lettering could not be fully discerned. The structural engineer requested a pause in work to review archival records. A portable terminal was brought in, and digital blueprints were consulted. None showed evidence of an earlier seal. The municipal inspector noted this discrepancy in his field log, writing that the inner wall appeared intentional and professionally constructed, not a collapse or natural obstruction. The crew debated whether to proceed. Ultimately, the decision was made to continue. The work order authorized access up to the sealed point, and the sealed point was now ambiguous. The inner wall was breached near the center where the material appeared weakest. As the opening widened, cold air flowed outward from the space beyond. This was unexpected. The tunnel was not connected to any active ventilation system. Once the opening was large enough to allow entry, the safety officer conducted atmospheric testing. Oxygen levels were normal. No hazardous gases were detected. Beyond the inner wall, the tunnel continued. The floor was intact. The rails were gone, removed long ago, but the sleepers remained. Dust coverage was minimal, as though the space had been traversed more recently than the sealed section leading to it. At the far end of the visible stretch, another barrier could be seen. This one was not concrete. It was steel. A heavy gate spanned the width of the tunnel, bolted into the surrounding rock. The gate bore a stenciled warning, faded but legible in parts. The words, "Do not enter," were visible, along with a hazard symbol no longer in common use. The municipal inspector ordered the crew to halt. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded. The presence of multiple containment structures was now undeniable. The inspector contacted his supervisor, relaying the situation verbally. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When the inspector returned, he stated that the instruction was to document the findings and reseal the outer barrier. The structural engineer objected. He argued that the existence of a steel gate suggested prior knowledge of a hazard beyond, and that leaving the inner space unexamined posed a liability risk. The inspector reiterated the directive. The crew complied. Before resealing, the junior surveyor was instructed to retrieve a dropped tool that had rolled through the opening into the newly revealed section. He entered the space briefly, no more than a few steps past the inner wall. According to his later statement, the tunnel beyond the second seal felt different. He did not elaborate further. He retrieved the tool and exited immediately. The outer seal was restored using modern materials. The inner wall and steel gate were left untouched. The final report from this operation includes several redactions. The visible text states that an unexpected reinforcement was encountered. Access beyond was deemed unnecessary, and the tunnel was secured. The phrase "already sealed" appears once, handwritten in the margin, without attribution. 2 years later, a drainage assessment team was dispatched to the same region following reports of groundwater intrusion in nearby active tunnels. Their scope included identifying potential pathways for water migration through abandoned structures. The sealed tunnel was flagged as a possible contributor. This time, the crew arrived with drilling equipment designed to bore small inspection holes through sealed barriers. Their intention was not to reopen the tunnel, but to assess moisture levels beyond the seal. When the first bore penetrated the outer wall, the drill bit encountered resistance sooner than expected. Core samples extracted from the hole revealed layered construction. The team lead noted in his log that the tunnel appeared to have been sealed, reopened, and sealed again. He added that this was unusual but not unprecedented in older infrastructure. A second bore hole was drilled at a different height. The result was the same. The team requested permission to expand the inspection. Approval was granted. As the bore widened, a camera probe was inserted. The footage recovered from that probe is incomplete. The first 30 seconds show the expected void behind the outer wall. The camera then passes through the inner barrier, which had been breached previously. Beyond that, the tunnel is visible, illuminated by the probe's light. The steel gate appears briefly at the edge of the frame. Then the footage cuts. The team lead reported equipment malfunction. The probe was retrieved and found to be intact. No cause for the interruption was identified. At this point, the documentation begins to shift in tone. Emails between team members discuss the possibility that the tunnel had been accessed unofficially at some point in the past. One message speculates about undocumented repairs following an incident that never made it into the public record. Another suggests that records may have been lost during an earlier administrative merger. No one suggests opening the tunnel fully. Instead, a recommendation is made to reinforce the existing seal. The recommendation is approved. A new concrete layer is added over the existing barrier, increasing the thickness further. Modern hazard markings are applied. The access point is logged as secured. The tunnel is now officially sealed. The next discovery occurs 5 years later. A major transit expansion project requires rerouting of several underground utilities. Updated surveys reveal discrepancies between mapped subsurface structures and actual conditions. In multiple locations, voids are detected where none should exist. One of these voids corresponds to the sealed tunnel. A ground-penetrating radar scan shows a continuous hollow space extending beyond the sealed section, deeper than previously recorded. The scan also indicates dense material layers at regular intervals along the tunnel's length. The interpretation suggests repeated construction events. A review meeting is convened. The meeting minutes, partially recovered, indicate confusion over jurisdiction. No current department claims responsibility for the tunnel. The asset is listed as inactive, with no assigned owner. Despite this, a decision is made to physically verify the scan results. A foreman is assigned to lead the inspection. His name appears here for the first time. The foreman's official logs are procedural. He notes crew assignments, safety briefings, and equipment checks. He records the condition of the access door, remarking that it appears to have been replaced more recently than the surrounding structure. On the day of entry, the crew encounters the reinforced seal. The foreman notes the thickness and comments that it exceeds current standards for sealing inactive tunnels. They begin removal. As layers are stripped away, the pattern becomes familiar. Modern concrete gives way to older material. Tool marks change, aggregate, shifts, the foreman writes. This was done more than once. Behind the layered seals, the inner tunnel is revealed again. The steel gate remains in place. This time, the gate is unlocked. The locking mechanism shows signs of wear, inconsistent with long-term disuse. The foreman photographs the latch and notes that it appears to have been opened and closed repeatedly. No record exists of such access. The crew hesitates. The foreman records that he feels they are standing in a place that has already been decided against. He does not explain what he means. He orders the gate opened. Beyond it, the tunnel slopes downward more steeply than the mapped section. The walls change construction style. The ceiling is lower. The air is colder. The foreman writes one final procedural note before the format changes entirely. Proceeding past secondary containment. The discovery phase ends here, not because there is nothing more to document, but because the nature of the documentation changes. What follows no longer reads like routine infrastructure records. It reads like an attempt to remember why something was buried. The documentation following the opening of the steel gate does not appear in the official project archive. It exists as fragments recovered from personal devices, handwritten notes, and audio logs recorded on equipment not listed in the inventory. The transition is abrupt. Where the earlier records were structured, time-stamped, and signed, these materials are inconsistent in format and chronology. Some entries overlap. Others contradict one another. None were submitted through formal channels. The foreman's personal log resumes first. He writes that the tunnel beyond the gate does not match any known design standard used by the authority. The curvature is wrong. The reinforcement spacing is irregular. The concrete composition shifts every few meters, as if poured in stages using different mixes. In several places, the walls show patchwork repairs that do not align with the surrounding structure. The crew advances slowly. Temporary lighting is installed, but the beam of each lamp seems to fade more quickly than expected. Batteries drain faster than normal. This is noted without comment. Approximately 50 meters past the gate, they encounter the first marker. It is a sign, bolted directly into the wall. The material is enamel-coated steel, heavily worn. The lettering style is outdated, using terminology no longer present in modern safety codes. The foreman transcribes the text rather than photographing it, writing that the paint flakes when disturbed. The sign reads, "Secondary Containment Zone. Do not proceed without authorization." There is no indication of what constitutes authorization. The crew pauses. The safety officer suggests turning back and reporting the find. The foreman notes that the tunnel has already been accessed beyond this point, citing the wear patterns on the floor. Footprints are visible in the dust, overlapping and layered. Some appear recent. Others are partially filled with sediment, suggesting age. The footprints are all oriented in the same direction. Deeper. The decision is made to continue. As they move further, the tunnel ceiling lowers gradually. The maintenance walkway disappears, replaced by a roughened ledge along the wall. Water drips intermittently from above, but there is no standing water. The air temperature drops enough that breath becomes faintly visible. Radio communication degrades. The foreman notes that transmissions echo, repeating fragments of speech with slight delays. At first, this is attributed to signal reflection in the confined space. Later entries suggest the echoes persist even when no one is speaking. At roughly 100 meters past the gate, they encounter the second seal. This one is partial. A thick concrete bulkhead spans the lower half of the tunnel, leaving a narrow crawl space above it. The top edge of the concrete is uneven, as though poured quickly or under constraint. Embedded within the surface are lengths of rebar cut flush, their ends oxidized. Carved directly into the concrete using a blunt tool are several words. The foreman copies them exactly as written. Do not open again. There is no date, no initials. The safety officer argues that this constitutes sufficient warning to terminate the inspection. The foreman records the objection, then records his decision to proceed anyway. He writes that the warning appears old and that no active hazard indicators are present. One crew member volunteers to climb over the bulkhead and check the space beyond. He does so without incident and reports that the tunnel continues, unchanged. They all cross. Beyond the partial seal, the tunnel walls bear markings that are not part of the original construction. Lines, arrows, and numbers appear intermittently, drawn in chalk or grease pencil. Some markings are repeated, overwritten multiple times as if revised. Others trail off mid-line. The foreman notes that the markings resemble survey annotations, but no consistent scale or reference point can be identified. At this point, timestamps become unreliable. Several entries list the same time for different events. Others are missing times entirely. The foreman begins writing relative durations instead, noting how long they have been walking rather than what hour it is. He estimates they have been underground for less than 2 hours. The third barrier is encountered unexpectedly. It is not a wall, but a narrowing. The tunnel constricts to half its width, reinforced by steel ribs bolted into the surrounding rock. The ribs are numbered sequentially. The numbering begins at 37. There is no record of ribs 1 through 36. The space between the ribs is filled with concrete, leaving only a narrow passage at floor level. The crew must pass single file, crouching. On the first rib, a small plaque is affixed. The foreman photographs it, though the image is later recovered corrupted. He transcribes the text in his log. Primary containment established. Structural integrity prioritized over access. The language is clinical, familiar. Beyond the ribbed section, the tunnel opens again into a larger chamber. This chamber does not appear on any map. The floor slopes downward into darkness beyond the reach of their lights. Along the walls, equipment has been abandoned. Old lamps, spools of cable, a folding table collapsed under its own weight. Everything is coated in a thin layer of dust, except for a narrow path down the center, where the dust has been disturbed. The path leads onward. The foreman records that the chamber feels occupied, though no one else is present. He clarifies that this is not an emotional reaction, but a spatial one, like entering a room where furniture has been recently moved. They set up a temporary staging area and attempt to establish a fixed position for navigation. Laser range finders give inconsistent readings. Distances measured forward do not match distances measured back. The safety officer recommends marking their route with paint. The foreman agrees. They mark the wall at shoulder height every 10 meters with a simple line. Later entries note that some of these marks are missing when they look back. The descent continues. The foreman's writing becomes more personal here. He notes that the tunnel appears to predate the rail spur entirely. The construction style suggests an earlier purpose, possibly unrelated to transit. He speculates about wartime infrastructure or early industrial experiments, but acknowledges there is no documentation to support this. Another sign is encountered, this one mounted on a freestanding post driven into the floor. The sign is newer than the others. The text is printed, not painted. Access beyond this point is not authorized. Reseal upon exit. There is a signature line at the bottom. It is blank. The crew debates again. Voices are raised. The foreman records the arguments but does not transcribe names. Ultimately, the decision to continue is justified by the lack of clear ownership or hazard classification. The foreman writes that they cannot reseal what they have not assessed. Beyond the sign, the tunnel walls show signs of stress. Cracks run vertically and diagonally, some filled with older repair compound. In several places, the repairs overlap, indicating repeated attempts to stabilize the same section. Embedded in one repair patch is a laminated paper sheet, partially dissolved by moisture. The foreman carefully extracts it. The text is faint but legible in parts. It appears to be a memo. The heading references a containment review committee. The date is smudged, but the year appears to be earlier than the original sealing on record. The body of the memo discusses risk assessment, with repeated references to exposure duration and observer effect. One sentence is underlined. Extended presence increases recurrence. The foreman does not comment on this line. Audio recordings from this stage capture irregular sounds, not voices but rhythmic impacts, like distant machinery cycling. The crew attempts to triangulate the source, but the sound does not behave predictably. It fades when they stop moving and grows louder when they advance. At one point, the sound aligns with their footsteps, matching pace. This is noted. The tunnel continues to slope downward, then levels out. The foreman writes that the ground feels more solid here, less prone to vibration. The air smells faintly metallic. They encounter another gate. This one is open. The hinges are intact. The locking bar is retracted. There is no sign of forced entry. Attached to the gate is a tag, similar to those used in lockout procedures. The tag is brittle with age. The foreman records the text. Closed pending outcome. There is no outcome listed. Beyond the open gate, the tunnel walls are lined with panels. Each panel is removable, secured with bolts. Several panels have been taken off and stacked neatly against the wall. Behind one missing panel, a cavity is visible. Inside the cavity are personal items: a hard hat, a jacket, a notebook. The notebook is water-damaged but readable. It contains dated entries, written in a different hand than the foreman's. The dates progress over several weeks. The writer describes repeated inspections, increasing restrictions, and pressure to minimize documentation. One entry reads, "They want it sealed again. They say it is safer if no one knows what is past the first wall. I asked who decided that. No one answered." The final entry trails off mid-sentence. The foreman notes that the handwriting matches the style of the carved warning on the partial seal. The crew becomes aware that they are not the first to descend this far, nor the second. They attempt to turn back. The route behind them appears unchanged, but their progress is slower. Distances feel longer. The chamber with the abandoned equipment is not where they expect it to be. When they reach it, the items appear rearranged. The folding table is upright. The paint marks on the wall are gone. Radio contact with the surface fails entirely. The foreman records that he considers ordering a full retreat and immediate resealing. He also records that he does not give the order. He writes that there is a growing sense that the tunnel is not something to be exited casually, that leaving requires completion of something, though he cannot articulate what. The final entries in this section are brief. They descend again. The foreman notes another sign ahead, partially visible in the distance. He does not transcribe it. He writes only, "We have been here before." The descent continues past the limits of formal inspection and into something closer to recognition. The tunnel no longer feels like an abandoned structure. It feels like a process that has been interrupted repeatedly and resumed by different people, each time with less certainty than the last. This is where the documentation fractures entirely. What follows in the next section is not a continuation of procedure, but an attempt to understand why the tunnel was sealed, reopened, and sealed again. The materials that follow do not form a continuous record. There is no single voice that carries them forward, no clear sequence that can be reconstructed with confidence. What exists instead are fragments that overlap in content, but not in perspective, as if multiple attempts were made to document the same realization from slightly different angles. The foreman's log resumes briefly, though the handwriting is less controlled. He writes that they passed the sign he could not bring himself to transcribe. Later examination of a blurred photograph recovered from his device suggests the sign read simply, "Tertiary phase active." The lettering was not warning red, but neutral black, as though intended for internal reference rather than deterrence. Beyond the sign, the tunnel changes again. The walls lose their patchwork appearance and become uniform, smooth, and uninterrupted by repairs. The ceiling height stabilizes. The temperature stops dropping. The metallic smell fades. It is as though the tunnel has reached a completed state after a long sequence of revisions. The foreman notes that the space feels maintained. The floor is clean, not free of dust, but evenly coated, without footprints or drag marks. The lighting equipment they brought seems to illuminate less here, not because of darkness, but because the surfaces absorb the light rather than reflect it. One of the crew members records an audio note stating that the tunnel reminds him of a hallway in a hospital after hours, not abandoned but waiting. At this depth, they encounter the first room. It is not a chamber carved out of necessity or convenience. It is rectangular, symmetrical, and intentionally constructed. The walls are lined with panels similar to those seen earlier, but here they are all in place. Each panel is labeled with a number. The numbering does not begin at 1. The lowest visible number is 9. In the center of the room is a recessed area in the floor, covered by a steel plate secured with bolts. The plate bears scuff marks consistent with repeated removal and replacement. Nearby, stacked neatly against the wall, are several sets of bolts, sorted by size. The foreman records that no one speaks for several minutes. The safety officer suggests that the room may have been used for monitoring or equipment storage. The structural engineer disagrees, noting the absence of conduit, power supply, or mounting brackets. One crew member asks why the numbering starts at 9. No one answers. They remove one of the wall panels. Behind it is not wiring or machinery, but another surface. A second wall set back by approximately half a meter. The space between is empty, except for dust and a few scraps of paper that disintegrate when touched. On the inner wall are markings. These are not technical. They are sentences written directly onto the concrete in marker and chalk. Some are crossed out, others are circled. The handwriting varies, but the phrasing repeats. We thought it was contained. Duration matters. Observation increases stability until it does not. One line is written repeatedly, each time with heavier pressure. Do not stay. The foreman orders the panel replaced. They move on. The tunnel beyond the room slopes gently upward, then straightens. The foreman notes that this contradicts the expectation that they are descending deeper. According to his calculations, they should be well below the depth of any documented infrastructure. Laser measurements still fail to produce consistent results. Another audio log captures a discussion about time. One crew member states that his watch has stopped. Another says his is running fast. A third says the display is blank. The foreman does not comment on this in writing, but the pacing of his entries suggests increasing urgency. His sentences shorten. He stops qualifying statements. He begins to write in imperatives. Keep moving. Do not linger. They reach a second room. This one is larger, circular, with a domed ceiling. The walls are bare. The floor is marked with concentric rings etched into the concrete. At the center is a raised platform, no more than a few inches high. On the platform is a chair. The chair is bolted to the floor. It is an ordinary chair, industrial, utilitarian, the kind used in control rooms and workshops. The seat is worn. The armrests are polished smooth by use. Attached to the back of the chair is a bracket, empty. The foreman records that no one approaches the chair at first. They circle the room instead, examining the walls. There are no signs, no markings, no panels to remove. Then one crew member notices something on the floor near the platform. It is a line of darker concrete, forming a partial arc around the chair. The line is not part of the etched rings. It appears to be a boundary. The safety officer suggests it marks a safe distance. The structural engineer suggests it marks an optimal position. The foreman writes that he understands suddenly why the tunnel was sealed. Not because of something dangerous in the conventional sense, but because of something that required repeated presence to function. He writes, "This place does not do anything by itself." The audio recordings from this room are the clearest in the file. Background noise drops away almost entirely. Voices sound close, even when speakers are across the room. One crew member sits in the chair. This is not recorded in the foreman's log, but it is captured on audio. There is a brief argument, then the sound of movement, then the creak of the chair. The crew member laughs nervously and says that nothing is happening. Several seconds pass. Then he says that he feels like he has already been here. He describes a sensation of familiarity, not with the room, but with the act of sitting. He says it feels like resuming a task rather than starting one. The foreman orders him to stand. The crew member does not respond immediately. When he does, he asks how long they have been waiting for him to finish. No one understands the question. The foreman repeats the order. The crew member stands. He appears disoriented, but unharmed. He cannot articulate what he experienced, only that it felt incomplete. The foreman writes that this is when he realizes the tunnel is not a place, but a process. Each sealing was an attempt to interrupt it. Each reopening was an unintentional resumption. They leave the room. Beyond it, the tunnel narrows again, then widens into a long corridor with evenly spaced doorways on both sides. Most of the doors are sealed. A few are open, revealing empty rooms, similar in design but lacking the chair. The foreman notes that the numbering on the doors matches the panel numbers seen earlier. 9, 10, 11. He does not find door 1 through 8. Inside one open room, they find a pile of notebooks stacked carefully on the floor. The notebooks are numbered. The earliest visible number is 4. The entries are written by different hands, but the structure is consistent. Each notebook begins with the description of initial discovery, followed by escalating concern, followed by a decision point. The decision point is always the same: reseal. In later notebooks, an additional note appears after the decision. Someone will reopen this. The foreman records that he does not know how many times this has happened. He estimates at least 3, possibly more. Each iteration seems to have gone further than the last. One notebook contains a diagram of the chair room. The diagram includes measurements, angles, and notes about optimal exposure duration. A margin note reads, "Do not exceed threshold or subject becomes anchor." The foreman does not define what anchor means. The final room they enter is different. It is not sealed. It is empty. The walls are bare. The floor is smooth. There are no markings, no equipment, no furniture. The room feels unfinished, as though awaiting something. At the far end is a final barrier. This one is not concrete or steel. It is a door. The door is closed. There is no handle on their side. Mounted beside the door is a small placard. The text is printed, clean, and unweathered. Final phase pending observer. The foreman records that they do not open the door. He writes that they understand now why the tunnel was sealed twice. Each sealing occurred after someone realized how close they were to completing something irreversible. Each time, the records were minimized, the warnings made more explicit, and the barriers reinforced. But time erodes memory. Jurisdictions change. People retire. Eventually, someone always decides to look again. The foreman writes that the tunnel does not force anyone forward. It simply waits. The last entries in his log are addressed to no one in particular. He writes that sealing the tunnel again will not solve the problem. It will only delay the next iteration. He suggests that permanent containment would require something else. Someone. He does not finish the thought. The final recovered audio recording begins with the sound of drilling. The foreman is giving instructions. He orders the crew to withdraw equipment and prepare sealing materials. He states clearly that they will not be opening the final door. A crew member asks what they should document. There is a long pause. The foreman replies that they should document the seal. Only the seal. The audio ends abruptly. What follows is an unsigned report filed weeks later, recommending that the tunnel be permanently decommissioned and filled. The report cites structural instability and redundant infrastructure. It makes no mention of inner chambers, numbered rooms, or containment phases. The recommendation is approved. Concrete is poured. Access points are destroyed. Maps are updated. This time, the seal is thicker than all the others combined. The file contains one last item: a handwritten note not attached to any official document. The handwriting matches the foreman's. It reads, "They will find it again." They always do. If you are reading this, do not try to understand what it does. Understanding is part of the process. The final sealing of the tunnel was carried out under a different authority name than any of the previous closures. By that time, the original transit body no longer existed as a discrete entity. Its responsibilities had been absorbed, redistributed, and renamed enough times that no single office retained institutional memory of the site's full history. The documentation reflects this erosion. Earlier files are detailed, conflicted, and personal. The last report is brief, procedural, and complete. Concrete fill was selected instead of barriers or bulkheads. The recommendation notes that filling the tunnel entirely would eliminate future maintenance obligations and remove the structure from all active and inactive inventories. Once filled, it would no longer be considered a tunnel at all, but a stabilized subsurface mass. The work was completed over several nights. There are no records indicating whether the inner chambers were filled separately or whether the concrete was poured from the primary access point only. No internal inspection footage was preserved. No as-built diagrams exist. The final confirmation consists of a signed form stating that the void had been eliminated to the satisfaction of the overseeing engineer. That engineer does not appear elsewhere in the file. Following the fill, updated subsurface scans were conducted for the transit expansion project that prompted the inspection. Those scans show no continuous void in the area where the tunnel once existed. The anomaly flags were cleared. Construction proceeded as planned. The site has not been reopened. However, during my review, I noted that the scans still indicate irregular density gradients at consistent intervals along the former tunnel's length. These gradients are dismissed in the accompanying analysis as material settling differences. The explanation is plausible. It is also identical to language used in other Vault 13 files involving filled shafts, sealed stairwells, and collapsed access corridors, later found to have retained internal structure. No further incidents have been recorded at this location. What remains unsettled is not the physical state of the tunnel, but the pattern surrounding it. Each reopening was justified by necessity rather than curiosity. Fiber installation, drainage assessment, expansion planning. Each time the discovery of prior containment was treated as an inconvenience rather than a warning. The decisions to proceed were made incrementally by different people, each operating within a limited scope of responsibility. No single individual chose to resume the process described in the inner documentation. They simply failed to stop it. The repeated references to duration, observation, and recurrence appear across multiple hands and eras. Whatever function the tunnel served, it did not rely on a machine or a mechanism that could be dismantled. It relied on attention, on continued engagement, on the natural human impulse to understand what has been deliberately hidden. That impulse was interrupted repeatedly through sealing, but never addressed directly. The foreman's final note suggests that he understood this. His implication that permanent containment would require an observer rather than a barrier aligns uncomfortably well with the numbered rooms, the bolted chair, and the concept of an anchor referenced in earlier notebooks. No records indicate that such a solution was implemented. There is no evidence that anyone volunteered to remain. Vault 13 cross-references this file with several others involving underground infrastructure, where containment measures escalate without explanation and are later undone by administrative decay. In none of those cases is there confirmation that the underlying issue was resolved, only that it was delayed. This file will remain restricted. If the filled tunnel is ever rediscovered through excavation or redevelopment, the absence of voids may be interpreted as proof that concerns were unfounded. Should that occur, I recommend that no attempt be made to excavate the irregular density regions noted in the final scans. They should be treated as structural anomalies and left undisturbed. Understanding, as noted in the recovered warning, appears to be cumulative. This archive exists to preserve records, not to complete processes that others chose to abandon. End of file. Catalogued under subterranean containment failures. This concludes the recovered file. May future listeners take caution in its implications. The Archivist, Vault 13.